The applause was still echoing through the dining room when a hand closed around my wrist. "Don't react," a woman's voice whispered. I turned instinctively, but she shook her head before I could speak. "Your father-in-law put something in your drink." For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. "What?" "Don't drink it, please." She released my wrist as quickly as she'd grabbed it. Before I could ask who she was or why she was telling me this, she disappeared into the crowd moving between the hallway and the patio. I stood frozen outside the dining room doorway, my untouched wineglass still resting on the table where I'd left it. Then I looked up. Richard Hayes, my father-in-law, was already watching me from across the room. The moment our eyes met, he smiled. Not warmly. Patiently. As if he were waiting for me to return to my seat. As if he expected something to happen next. That smile made every instinct in my body scream that the stranger hadn't invented a single word. I forced myself to breathe normally and walked back into the room before anyone noticed I'd stopped moving. My younger sister, Emma, was glowing as relatives crowded around her with congratulations. My parents were laughing with her fiancé's family. Crystal glasses clinked together beneath the warm lights, and every face in the room looked relaxed. Everyone except mine. No one knew that less than a minute earlier, a complete stranger had quietly told me not to drink from the glass waiting beside my plate. I had helped organize nearly every detail of Emma's engagement dinner. The floral arrangements, the seating chart, even the wine selection had passed through my hands over the previous week. I wanted the evening to be perfect because Emma deserved one celebration untouched by family drama. Ironically, I had spent years making sure other people's happiness came before my own. Whenever Richard made one of his polished little comments about how I still had a lot to learn, or how our family has certain standards, I smiled politely and changed the subject. If he excluded me from conversations about family investments or vacations, I pretended not to notice. My husband, Daniel, always insisted his father simply had an old-fashioned personality. "You're reading too much into it," he'd tell me. Eventually, I stopped arguing. Keeping the peace seemed easier than proving I was being quietly pushed aside. But standing there, with that warning echoing in my ears, memories I had dismissed suddenly fit together differently. Richard insisting on serving everyone's drinks himself. Richard encouraging me to have another glass at previous family dinners. Richard always watching people's reactions more carefully than anyone else listened to conversations. Maybe they were coincidences. Maybe they weren't. Emma tapped her fork against her champagne flute. "Can everyone settle down? Dad wants to make another toast." The room quieted instantly. Richard rose from his chair with practiced confidence. His own wineglass sat only inches away from mine. The glasses were identical. The wine inside them looked exactly the same. No one was looking at me. Everyone was watching Emma. The applause began again. My heartbeat became deafening. I reached for my glass. Then, using the movement of standing to clap for my sister as cover, I quietly exchanged my untouched glass with Richard's. It took less than 2 seconds. No spilled wine. No suspicious movement. No one noticed. Richard smiled toward the room, lifted the glass I had just switched, and began his congratulatory speech. I kept my hands folded beneath the table and forced myself not to look at him. Minutes passed. Conversation returned. Dinner continued. I counted every minute without realizing I was counting. Then, roughly 20 minutes later, Richard suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. He blinked several times. His words began to slur. Guests exchanged puzzled glances as his confident smile slowly disappeared from his face. And in that terrifying moment, I realized the stranger may have saved my life. The room fell strangely quiet. Richard gripped the back of his chair, as though the floor had shifted beneath him. "I'm fine," he muttered, forcing a laugh that sounded nothing like his usual polished voice. Must have stood up too quickly. A few relatives chuckled politely, eager to dismiss the awkward moment. Emma frowned. Mr. Hayes, are you all right? Perfectly. He loosened his tie and reached for the edge of the table. Just give me a second. I watched him carefully, without moving. 20 minutes ago, he had looked completely composed. Now his eyes struggled to focus on the people in front of him. Every instinct told me the stranger had been right. But another part of me wondered if I had just made a terrible mistake. Maybe Richard really was ill. Maybe I had imagined the warning because of years of feeling unwanted. Daniel leaned toward me. You okay? I hesitated. Does your dad seem different to you? He glanced toward Richard before shrugging. He skipped lunch. He's probably exhausted. I lowered my voice. What if it's something else? Daniel sighed. Melisa. There was that tone again. The same patient tone he always used when he believed I was worrying over nothing. You always assume the worst when it comes to Dad. I don't. You do. He's never made things easy for you, I know. But tonight isn't about old disagreements. Let's not create problems during Emma's engagement. Create problems? The words landed harder than he realized. I wasn't trying to ruin anyone's evening. I'd spent the last week making sure everything ran perfectly. Yet somehow, I was still the one expected to stay quiet. I looked across the room at Richard. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the water pitcher. That tiny shake reminded me of dozens of moments I'd pushed out of my mind. The afternoon he forgot to tell me about a family meeting everyone else attended. The holiday dinner where he introduced every spouse by profession except me. This is Daniel's wife, Melisa. Nothing more. When I'd later asked if I'd done something wrong, he'd smiled pleasantly. Oh, don't be so sensitive. Daniel had laughed it off. He didn't mean anything by it. Those words had become painfully familiar. He didn't mean anything by it. Don't overthink it. That's just how he is. I had accepted those explanations because challenging them only led to more uncomfortable conversations. Now, watching Richard struggle to remain steady, every one of those memories felt different. Not cruel enough to confront, just subtle enough to deny. A movement near the doorway caught my attention. The woman. She stood partially hidden behind a group of guests carrying dessert plates. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply met my eyes for a brief second. Then she gave one almost invisible shake of her head. Stay calm. Don't say anything. Before I could react, she disappeared behind another cluster of relatives. Richard suddenly cleared his throat. Water. His voice cracked. Can someone get me some water? Emma immediately reached for a bottle. Here. He accepted it with unsteady hands. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. My mother whispered to my father. Emma's future in-laws stopped talking altogether. No one wanted to admit something was clearly wrong. Richard drank half the bottle in one long swallow before trying to stand again. I'm perfectly capable of finishing this toast. He managed only 2 more sentences before losing his place completely. The confident man, who normally controlled every room now, seemed unable to remember what he had been saying. An uncomfortable silence settled over the dining room. Then I felt someone walk slowly beside my chair. Without looking at me, the same woman quietly said, "This isn't the first time he's done this." She continued walking before I could answer. I stared after her, realizing this night was becoming far bigger than a single poisoned glass. Richard slammed his hand against the table. The sharp sound silenced every conversation in the room. I'm tired of people pretending everything is perfect, he snapped. Dozens of faces turned toward him. Emma slowly lowered her glass. Dad, what are you talking about? Richard looked around the room, his expression shifting between anger and confusion. You all sit here smiling, he said, pointing at several relatives, as if none of you have lied to me. The room went still. His brother frowned. Richard, maybe you should sit down. I don't need to sit down. His voice echoed across the dining room. I know exactly what's happening. He turned toward another relative. And you, he barked, you only came tonight because you want another loan. The man's face flushed. What? You heard me. A few nervous laughs escaped from guests who assumed he was joking. But Richard wasn't smiling. He kept talking. One accusation after another. Old business disagreements. Private family arguments. Financial favors that had never been discussed publicly. Each sentence made the silence heavier. Emma's fiancé leaned toward her and whispered, "Has he ever acted like this before?" She slowly shook her head. Never. Across the room, I noticed several guests quietly pulling out their phones. No one said they were recording. They simply started. The celebration that had filled the room with laughter less than half an hour earlier had become something no one wanted to interrupt, and no one wanted to forget. Richard suddenly pointed toward me. Someone poisoned me. Every head turned. What? Daniel asked, stunned. My drink, Richard shouted. Somebody put something in my drink. The accusation hung in the air. No one moved. I slowly stood from my chair. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, but my voice stayed even. Richard. He glared at me. Everyone at this table was drinking from identical glasses. He said nothing. I continued. You personally poured every glass before dinner. Several relatives nodded as they remembered. And yours wasn't prepared any differently than anyone else's, unless someone changed it after you poured them. A ripple of confusion spread through both families. Richard's expression tightened. Daniel looked from his father to me, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Before anyone spoke again, the woman from the hallway stepped forward. For the first time, she addressed the room instead of whispering. My name is Laura Bennett. No one recognized her except Richard. The color drained from his face. You. She looked directly at him. Yes. Then she turned to everyone else. I worked as Richard's executive assistant for almost 9 years. Murmurs spread around the dining room. I resigned several months ago. Emma asked quietly, why? Laura took a slow breath. Because I watched him use medication to manipulate people during private business meetings. The room erupted. That's ridiculous. Is she serious? What is she talking about? Laura raised a hand. I don't have proof of what happened back then. She looked at Melisa. But when I walked past the dining room earlier tonight, I saw the same prescription bottle I saw countless times in his office. Richard stepped toward her. You're lying. No, Laura answered calmly. I'm finally telling the truth. Richard opened his mouth again, but staggered slightly, forcing himself to grip the edge of the table. The room fell silent once more. Emma looked ready to cry. Daniel stared at his father as though seeing him for the first time. Melisa realized this couldn't have been a decision Richard made at the last minute. If Laura recognized that bottle instantly, then whatever he had planned tonight had roots stretching back much further than Emma's engagement dinner. The sound of approaching sirens drifted faintly through the open patio doors. Moments later, paramedics entered the house. After a brief examination, one of them looked carefully at the half-finished wineglass sitting in front of Richard. He turned to his partner and spoke quietly, but loudly enough for those nearest to hear. Don't discard that glass. He carefully lifted it with a protective evidence bag. I want this preserved. The room went completely silent. The engagement party was over. No one officially announced it, but the music had stopped. Untouched desserts sat on the buffet table, and clusters of relatives stood whispering instead of celebrating. The paramedics remained with Richard, while another guest quietly informed the dispatcher that there was reason to believe a drink had been tampered with. Within minutes, 2 uniformed police officers arrived. One officer spoke calmly. "We're not here to accuse anyone. We simply need to understand why medical personnel believe this could involve intentional poisoning." The sentence sent another wave of silence through the room. Richard immediately tried to regain control. "This is absurd," he snapped, his speech clearer than before but still slightly sluggish. "Somebody drugged me." The officer nodded. "Then we'll determine how that happened." Another officer carefully collected Richard's wineglass, followed by several identical glasses from the table. As they worked, conversations started breaking out around the room. Emma looked from one relative to another. "Did anyone see anything?" Her aunt hesitated. "Now that I think about it." Everyone turned toward her. Richard insisted on pouring every single glass himself. Another cousin slowly nodded. "I offered to help." "He wouldn't let me," someone else added. "He actually told me to leave the drinks to him," Daniel's uncle said. One memory triggered another. Piece by piece, details that had seemed meaningless only an hour earlier began fitting together. I felt my stomach tighten. I remembered Richard handing me my glass personally. His smile. His insistence. "Make sure you finish it before the speeches begin." At the time, it had sounded like nothing more than encouragement to relax. Now it sounded entirely different. I looked toward Daniel. He was staring blankly at the table. Then his eyes widened. "My dad." His voice barely came out. He wouldn't even let me refill the wine. Everyone looked at him. I asked if he wanted help before dinner. Daniel swallowed hard. He said he'd already arranged everything. The room grew even quieter. For the first time all evening, Daniel wasn't defending his father. He was remembering. One of the officers approached the home's security system. "We've been told there are cameras covering the dining room." Emma's fiancé nodded. "The entire first floor. Can we review the footage?" He immediately entered the access code. The television, mounted on the far wall, lit up. The recording began playing. Guests gathered without speaking. The footage showed relatives arriving. People greeting each other. Servers placing food on the tables. Then Richard entered, carrying a tray of wineglasses. The officer paused the video. "Let's continue from here." Everyone watched. Richard set the tray down. He looked over both shoulders. The dining room was empty. For several seconds, he stood completely alone. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Laura quietly closed her eyes. "I knew it." Richard pulled out a small bottle. The room collectively inhaled. The footage wasn't close enough to identify the label, but everyone could clearly see him unscrew the cap. He leaned over only one glass. Just one. Seconds later, he returned the bottle to his pocket. Then he rearranged the glasses before walking away as though nothing had happened. The video stopped. No one spoke. The silence lasted several long seconds. Richard suddenly lurched forward. "Turn that off." His voice cracked through the room. "You don't know what you're looking at." One of the officers stepped between him and the television. "Sir, please remain where you are." Richard ignored him. His face had lost every trace of the confidence that had defined him for years. His breathing became uneven. His eyes landed on me. Not with anger anymore. With desperation. He pointed directly at me. "You don't understand." His words echoed through the silent dining room. "You don't understand what she was about to inherit." The room froze. Every pair of eyes shifted toward me. No one knew what he meant. But everyone understood one thing. Whatever had started as a mysterious warning, outside the dining room had become something far bigger than a poisoned glass. Richard's words hung in the air. You don't understand what she was about to inherit. No one moved. The officer nearest him spoke first. Sir, if there's something relevant to this investigation, now is the time to explain it. Richard looked around the room, as if searching for someone who would rescue him. No one did. His son, Daniel, remained beside me. Emma stared at him in disbelief. My parents looked completely confused. Finally, Richard lowered himself into a chair. His shoulders, which had always seemed impossibly straight and confident, sagged for the first time since I'd known him. The lead officer turned to me. Mrs. Hayes, do you know what he's referring to? I slowly shook my head. I have no idea. Laura quietly stepped forward. I think I know where you should start looking. She reached into her handbag and removed a sealed envelope. I kept copies of documents I wasn't comfortable destroying. She handed the envelope to the officers. I never knew exactly why they mattered. I only knew Richard became obsessed with keeping one particular family trust hidden. The officers carefully opened the file. Inside were corporate correspondence, copies of shareholder records, and emails discussing an old investment trust connected to Richard's family business. One detective spent several minutes reviewing the documents before looking up. These records need to be verified, but they appear legitimate. Richard closed his eyes. He knew the secret was no longer his to control. Over the following days, investigators pieced everything together. Years earlier, one of the original investors in the family company had passed away. A clause buried inside the trust agreement transferred that investors' voting rights to the closest qualifying family beneficiary. Because of a series of unexpected legal events after another relative's death, that beneficiary wasn't Richard. It was me. I had never been told. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't requested anything. The transfer had happened automatically through the trust succession provisions. Within weeks, attorneys would have contacted me to finalize the paperwork. Those voting rights were significant enough to authorize an independent audit of the company's financial records. That was the audit Richard feared. Investigators soon discovered why. The company's books contained years of concealed financial misconduct. Money had been diverted through shell companies. Expenses had been disguised. Assets had been quietly transferred between businesses Richard controlled. The audit would have exposed everything. Richard believed there was only one way to stop it. If he could convince both families that I was unstable, that I had publicly embarrassed myself by appearing intoxicated during Emma's engagement celebration, then no one would trust me when the legal documents eventually surfaced. He never intended for anyone to suspect him. Instead, he planned to become the concerned father-in-law protecting his son from an unreliable wife. The entire evening had been carefully arranged around that lie. It unraveled because one person chose to tell the truth. Laboratory testing confirmed exactly what the security footage suggested. The sedative residue was found in the wine originally intended for me. The only reason Richard became ill was because I had quietly switched the glasses after Laura warned me. When the forensic report was read aloud, Daniel slowly turned toward his father. His voice was calm. She trusted you. Richard couldn't answer. You sat at the same table. Daniel's eyes filled with disappointment. And you tried to destroy her. Richard looked down at his hands. There was nothing left to deny. My parents struggled to process what had happened. My mother held my hands across the kitchen table a few days later. I'm sorry. She blinked back tears. When everything started that night, I thought you were imagining things. My father nodded. We should have believed you instead of assuming you were creating drama. Across the room, Emma quietly wiped her eyes. I keep thinking about it. She looked at me. My engagement party was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. She paused. And he chose that day because he thought nobody would question him. I reached across the table and hugged her. None of this was your fault. Before leaving town, Laura met me at a small cafe. I almost stayed silent, she admitted. I kept telling myself someone else would eventually stop him. She smiled faintly. But when I saw that bottle again, I couldn't walk away. I reached across the table. You saved my life. She shook her head. No. You believed me. The investigation moved quickly. Richard was removed from every leadership position within the company. The board appointed independent management, while forensic accountants reviewed years of financial records. Business partners who had once protected him began cooperating with investigators. Civil lawsuits followed, then criminal charges. The reputation Richard had spent decades building disappeared in a matter of months. Even relatives who had defended him publicly admitted they had ignored warning signs simply because he had always been the most powerful person in the room. Daniel made a decision that surprised everyone. He didn't try to excuse his father. He didn't ask me to forgive him immediately. Instead, he apologized. I should have listened. There was no justification, no explanation, only honesty. For the first time in our marriage, he stopped asking me to keep the peace at my own expense. Together, we worked with the trustees and independent auditors to protect the company and the employees whose livelihoods depended on it. The voting rights Richard had feared weren't used for revenge. They were used for accountability. Several months later, our family gathered again. This time it wasn't for an investigation. It was for a quiet dinner, celebrating Emma and her husband's first months of marriage. There were no grand speeches, no attempts to control the room. Every drink was poured openly onto the table where everyone could see. Laura joined us as an invited guest, no longer carrying secrets alone. The conversation was easy. The laughter sounded genuine. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to watch every word I said. When the evening came to an end, I picked up my glass. I looked around the table at the people who had finally chosen truth over appearances. Then I smiled, raised my glass, and realized that the quiet decision to switch two identical glasses had changed every future that night.